I've been a learning coach for the past 13 years. In that time, I've easily studied well over 10,000 hours. I've studied medicine, learning science, computing and AI, education, marketing, business, accounting, all sorts of things. And in the first 5 to 6 years of studying, I probably wasted about 80% of my time. I've made a lot of mistakes, but I have learned from them. So in this video, I'm going to compress 10,000 hours of studying into 15 important lessons that every student and learner of any age should know. Lesson number 1, cram early. There's this really logical piece of advice that one of my seniors gave to me when I was first entering into university. And honestly, this is probably the only reason I was able to make it through that year, even though my processes were so inefficient. He said, if you are the type of person that crams before an exam and that works for you and you can cram and do decently before an exam, and that was me during a lot of high school, then just do the same thing. Just cram, but do it at the very beginning. Don't wait until before the exam. Just cram the whole paper at the very, very beginning. And now you have an additional 2-3 months where you can spend your time finding gaps, filling gaps, and just getting to that next level of confidence. And the reason I give this advice to you is that not every situation requires you to have consistent diligence of studying for the entire year. And the worst case scenario is really you leave it to the last minute to cram and then you realize it's not enough and then now you're screwed. So if you feel like you can go faster than the cohort and you feel like you can finish things faster, just do it. Like, get through that stuff as quickly as you want to. Some of my uni students are actually doing that. Like, they're finishing their entire year's curriculum. Even for like medical students with huge curriculums, they're finishing in April, May, and then they're spending the rest of the year just literally 2-3 hours a week on just topping up their memory, looking for gaps, adding a few bits here and there. Like, it's such a relaxing experience of university, very different to how I went through uni. Lesson number 2, don't create learning debt. I think this is probably one of the most important concepts that I've picked up over the years. When I was in my first year of university trying to enter into medical school and studying like absolute crazy 17, 18, 19, 20 hours a day, barely sleeping at all, a lot of my time was spent on what I now realize as creating learning debt. Here's what I'd do. I would go to the lecture. During the lecture, I'd take a bunch of notes. Then I'd go and then I'd review my notes. And while I'm reviewing it and reading from the textbook, I would then go and make a bunch of flashcards. And this process of going through the textbook, making flashcards, rereading the notes, going through the lecture slides would take me somewhere along the lines of roughly 2 hours per lecture. And I was trying to be pretty comprehensive. And so with 3 or 4 lectures a day, this time would accumulate to around 6 to 8 hours per day on reviewing, making flashcards, reading through the textbook. And at the time I thought, this is time well spent because I'm doing a lot of good studying. But as I said before, I was studying way more than 8 hours a day. If I was studying 8 hours a day, I think I would have been really happy. I was studying double that amount of time. So what was I doing in the extra 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours a day? I was reviewing the stuff that I studied in the previous day and the week before that. So after I create, let's say, flashcards for 3-4 hours, I then spend another 3 or 4 hours to go over my flashcards. And this is what I mean by learning debt. When you're studying, the primary focus is to take that information, store it in your memory, and then be able to use that information in the level and way that you need to use it for your assessment or using it at work, whatever you need to learn it for. So time that does not contribute to that is a waste of time. If I spend 2 hours making flashcards, the time spent on making flashcards only creates learning in my brain when I then spend time later to go over them. There's very, very little learning generated from just making the flashcards in the first place. And so what I'm doing is I'm actually taking the learning I need to do today and I'm offloading that to a future version of myself. I'm saying, hey, You need to learn this, and you're giving yourself a task to deal with later. That is debt you have created for your future self. And so here's the problem with learning debt, is that debt does not scale. This becomes really obvious if I do a little bit of maths for you. So let's say, if we use my example, I'm spending 2 hours, and in this 2 hours, what am I doing? I'm creating a bunch of flashcards, and I'm also writing a bunch of notes. By the time I finish this 2 hours, I can promise you, I didn't have a great level of knowledge. And if I tested myself on this a week later, my retention would be 50% if I'm lucky. So now this has become debt. And so the next day, I now need to spend, let's say, another hour to go over my notes and to do my flashcards. So now that's an hour of debt I've given myself. But remember, tomorrow I need to do the same thing. So I'm also spending 2 hours on this day creating a new set of flashcards and notes for the stuff I learned on that day. And I'm creating another set of debt for myself where I might need to spend another hour going through that material. But the debt accumulates. So the thing that I did on the first day, just by doing it the next day, that debt hasn't cleared. I still don't have the retention that I need from it. So normally, if we look at some research around spaced repetition and how long it takes to really get that information solid, depends on the type of information, but it's usually between 3 to 7 repetitions is necessary to get the retention that you need. So I now need to do this again and again and again. And so every day I'm actually building up more debt that I'm able to clear. And that's why by the end of the semester, I would get to a point where I've got 2,000 flashcards that I need to do, and I'm spending 4 to 5 hours every single day just clearing through flashcards that I made previously and barely hanging in there in terms of getting through my textbook readings, reviewing the lecture recordings, and I'm already watching those lecture recordings at double or triple speed. There's nothing more I can do because I've got so much learning debt I need to get through in order to have made that previous learning useful. And until I go through and do those repetitions every single day, I'm not extracting the value of learning from that previous time that I spent. And one thing that I realized very clearly as soon as I entered into medical school was that there is a low ceiling of how effective this strategy can be. At a certain point, you just don't have enough time to do all of this repetition every single day. You are just trapped in this rat race, like this constant, never-ending grind of doing flashcards. At least that's what it felt for me for that first couple years of university. And so if we fast forward, and let's say I'm now in my 5th year of university, I've learned a lot about how to study, and what does my studying look like now to reduce the learning debt? So what changed is that I might be spending the same 2 hours up front, or sometimes even longer, but in the 2 hours, I'm getting like 80 to 90% of the learning that I need to get done first. I'm not trying to give my future self anything to do. My objective is to learn it really well, have a really good retention, a deep understanding, really connect it all together in that session. And there are a number of other strategies that I often talk about that help with that. But it's never possible to make this 100%. There is still going to be some stuff that you're not able to get done, that you do need that repetition for, that you do need to make those flashcards for, because it is a valuable tool, but it's only that 10 to 20%. And so the amount of debt that I'm carrying forward into the next day is minimal. And also, because my knowledge is so much deeper the first time I learn it, my retention is much stronger. So I don't actually need to repeat and review this every single day to keep on top of it. I can review it like once a week, and my retention is still high enough that it's sustainable. And so now I only need 15 minutes every 2 or 3 days to clear through the debt that I've created for myself. And that's very manageable. So take a really honest look at the way that you're studying and just ask yourself, how much of the time you spend on studying is spent on things where you know you haven't really learned it by the end of that time, and you're relying on your future self to do something to make that valuable. If you are spending a lot of time doing that, you're creating learning debt. And I strongly believe that it's impossible to improve your learning efficiency until you address that. It's lesson number 3. Study more, then study less. If you were to ask me, what is the number one thing that you can do to get better grades, better performance? The number one most important thing that you can do is just study more. And this is different to the advice that I normally give. But here's how it works. In the early stages, if this x-axis is the number of hours that you spend studying, and then here you've got your performance. If you're starting with not studying at all, and then you go from not studying at all to just studying more, your performance is going to increase a lot. And so there's actually a very large proportion of people who are just not putting in enough hours and not doing enough work to get the results. Now, what happens eventually is that extra hours start contributing less to your performance. So you get this thing called diminishing returns, right? So at a certain point, every extra hour of studying that you're doing per day is only increasing your performance by like 1 or 0.5%. And then you get to a point where actually it inverts. So the more hours you do, your performance starts declining. And this is because you're dropping in efficiency, you're burning yourself out. And so the trajectory of becoming better at studying is to, first of all, get to a point where you feel like you are actually studying enough. And I would say, and this varies a lot, but if it's a fairly competitive type of program that you're studying in, then somewhere along the lines of 3 to 5 hours a day is probably very reasonable. And beyond that, you're definitely going to start getting diminishing returns and potentially even dropping into the negative. So this is the study more part. And then comes then study less. This is the part that a lot of people miss. Once you get to a point where you do think you are actually studying a reasonable amount, your next focus is, how do I then study less? And the reason you switch focus is because the type of improvement and gain that you make with your study skills changes from an effort gain to an efficiency gain. If your solution to not getting the performance that you want is just to put in more hours, then you're not getting improvements in your process or your efficiency. You're just getting improvements in the effort that you're putting in, which is fine when you're at low effort. But if you are already at reasonable or high effort, then getting more effort gains is not likely to lead to the performance that you want, especially if there's a big gap between the performance that you want and the performance that you're consistently getting. And so by actively trying to study less and at the same time improve your performance, which I know sounds crazy and feels like a radical idea for some people, by actively switching that focus, it forces you to examine your process and think, how can I make it more efficient? Remember that studying efficiently means being able to do more with less. And if you are already on this path of increasing your efficiency, then your next lesson is lesson number 4. Study less, then study more. And I know that sounds like exactly the opposite of what I just said, but here's how it goes. Once you are now at that point where you are already working hard and you're trying to improve your efficiency and you're thinking about how to study less, the biggest barrier you'll face, and the biggest barrier I faced to actually improving and figuring out how to be more efficient, is that you just don't have enough time. At the moment, at that present situation, you have a certain level of performance, which we'll say P. And you're achieving this by having a certain process, which may not be that efficient. So we'll use a smaller bar for this. We'll make it red. And we'll say that's PRO, process. Combined with a certain amount of effort that you're putting in. And at the moment, you're putting in a reasonable amount of effort. When we start trying to reduce this effort, that process is not going to, at the exact same time, increase to become more efficient. It's not that easy. There's some trial and error and experimentation and mistakes you need to make to figure out how to learn more efficiently. So when your effort drops, your performance may actually drop at least a little bit. And so what I'm saying is, don't go from studying like 10 hours a day to now studying 2 hours a day, because your performance will plummet. Go from 10 hours a day to 9.5 hours a day to 9 hours a day. But expect that you may have a small decrease in your short-term performance, but you need the extra time. You need the extra time that you free up from studying a little bit less to figure out how to study more efficiently. You need time to reflect, to think, to learn about studying, to watch this video, to improve your process. And so there's a common saying that everyone knows: work smarter, not harder. But there's nothing wrong with working hard. And so some people say work smarter and harder. But as a coach, from a practical perspective, I think the most important one is work smarter, then harder. Because when you work too hard, you don't have time to figure out how to work smarter. Create time to work smarter. Once your process is more efficient, you can reinvest those hours that you took out before. You can increase your effort again if you really need to. Or you can use that extra time to sleep more, touch some grass. And just thinking about it now, I think I probably could have made the same progress on improving my learning efficiency that took me 2 years of university in like 6 months if I had just understood this, because I was so not willing to study less. Lesson number 5, plug the leak. If you are in a boat and the boat is leaking and filling with water, your number one priority is to plug the leak. You don't spend your time bucketing water out from the boat because it's futile. And the longer you wait to plug the leak, the more water there is for you to bucket out later, even after the leak has been plugged. This is exactly the same situation with studying. I do a lot of work with students that are transitioning from the high school into university, especially for competitive programs. And one of the most common pieces of feedback that I hear from these students is that as soon as they enter into university, it just feels like they're hit with this tsunami of work and uncertainty that they've never had to face before in high school. And I felt that like full force when I entered into university. I was like, the volume and the workload and the difficulty is so much higher than I expected. And a lot of people aren't able to adapt to that. And if it doesn't happen in university, usually the next place it happens is in graduating and entering into the workforce. And then they're hit again with that wave of responsibility and pressure that they didn't experience in university. And across my years of seeing thousands of people that get hit in the face with the tsunami, the successful learners are the ones that plug the leak first. Let's say that there are 2 types of people. The first type of person gets hit in the face with the tsunami, huge workload, realizes they're starting to fall behind. Retention isn't where it needs to be. They're not on top of their knowledge. And so they study more. Fine. They study more and they realize they're still falling behind. And they're still feeling like they're constantly playing catch up. And so they respond to this by studying even more and even more and even more until they get to a point where they're spending their entire time studying and they're not doing anything else other than studying, just to be able to feel like they are not drowning. Okay, if you haven't guessed already, that this person is what I did. Then you have the second type of person, which is they have the same initial experience. They're overwhelmed, they feel like they're falling behind. And initially they just try to study a little bit more, but then they realize that that isn't enough. And they realize that the issue here is that there's a leak. The process that they are using is not enough to keep up with the pace. They realize that even though they're falling behind just a little bit right now, and they're only 2 or 3 lectures behind, if they're falling behind now, if they wait 3 or 4 more weeks, they're now going to be 20 lectures behind. And so they realize that and spend their time to improve their process rapidly so that they are at least not falling behind anymore. And they're still 3 lectures behind, but every single day that passes, it's not adding more lectures to the backlog. It's not letting water continue into the boat. At the end of the day, these 2 students are going to be in very different situations. One student is going to be burnt out studying like crazy with a lot of stuff that they're fallen behind on that they need to catch up with. The other student will also have worked very, very hard, but they're in a position now that they're not falling behind anymore, and they can spend the additional time that they have on catching up on the things that they did fall behind on before. Who do you think will have the better outcome? And so here's like a very quick tip for you if you feel like you're this first person. You have a choice you can make with the time that you spend. Do I prepare for what I'm about to learn, or do I review the stuff that I've fallen behind on? If you can only do one of the two, prepare for what you're about to learn. There are certain strategies where you don't even need to be that good at them for it to be beneficial. One of those things is just doing a very, very quick pre-study. If you've got a 1-hour lecture coming up, spend 15 minutes pre-studying on just what you think are the most difficult and important parts of what you're about to learn. That may be enough to help you stay on top of what you are currently learning. That may be enough to help you plug the leak. It's not a crazy technique you need to spend weeks or months learning how to do. It could be about deciding to spend that extra 20, 30 minutes on this lecture to make sure you've really got it down, to maybe add a little bit more time and effort on critically thinking about the information, to process it a little bit more deeply, to make your memory stronger right now when you learn it and not create that learning debt. That may be the thing that helps you to plug that leak, or at least make that leak smaller. And yes, you will still be behind on everything that you're behind right now. But the real problem is not the fact that you have fallen behind. It's that you are falling behind. It's still happening. And the longer you leave it, the further behind you fall. Plug the leak, then clear the backlog. By the way, if you're finding these tips helpful and you want even more, then you may want to check out my free weekly newsletter. This is where I cover even more study tips and tricks and principles that took me over a decade to learn. The emails are very quick to read, but they can save you 10 plus hours a week. Again, it's completely free. The link is in the description below. And now on to the next piece of study advice. Lesson number 6, make learning hard. Effective learning is not easy. Effective learning doesn't feel fast, at least not at first. Anytime you learn something, that learning happens inside our brain. Okay, this is the brain. Information comes into our brain. Our brain does stuff with that information. It thinks about it. And then depending on how it thinks about it and processes that information, it outputs it as a memory. And we broadly call this process encoding. You're encoding information into your memory. And you need to do this if you want to have that knowledge to be able to use it and retrieve it for your applications like an exam. And for most people, this middle part, what happens in the brain, is the major limiter. This is the major constraint. This is your bottleneck. And so if you're having trouble with your retention and the quality of your memory, and you feel like you're forgetting things very quickly, or if you feel like no matter how hard you study, there are always these really difficult, complicated questions that you can never seem to answer, that's because of what's happening in the step before inside your brain. The way that your brain is processing it is not compatible with producing high quality memory or a deep level of understanding. And so it doesn't matter how fast or efficiently information comes into the brain. And it doesn't matter how much you repeat things in your memory of things that you previously learned. The major problem is that what's happening in the brain in the first place is not effective. So when I was struggling with learning, what did I do? I watched my lectures double speed, triple speed to try to get that information coming through faster. I did more flashcards. I did more repetitions. I took my cruddy memory, which was failing me every single day, and I just tried to brute force it through repetition to be better. I spent all my time here and here without realizing that the problem was here in the middle. And the thing is that effective learning, active learning, takes mental effort. Your brain needs to think deeply about what you're learning. It needs to evaluate it. It needs to compare it against what it already knows and compare it with what you're learning. It needs to actively look for patterns. And that process is the thing that creates effective learning. And so if your goalpost is like what mine was, where you think that getting better at learning means that learning is faster and easier, you're actually going to start making changes to your learning strategies that make your results worse. It's like, cool, I've now got this AI that's going to record the lecture, turn it into a transcript, and automatically create a bunch of flashcards for me. Is that saving me time? Yes. Could that be beneficial? Definitely. Is that going to solve the fundamental issue? No. because at the end of the day, my brain hasn't been involved in that process. In one way or another, I have to insert my brain into that process to do the heavy lifting and to do that deep thinking. I have these very clear memories of when I was in high school, and I thought, you know what? I don't know why. Like one day I just decided, like, I'm going to try to be like a diligent student. And so I would every day after school go to the university library, study with all the uni kids. And I would find a position and I would think like, this is the perfect position for me. Like I had my specific desk, and if someone was sitting there, I had like another place. And I would go there and I'd get all my books out, and then I would just like study till 10 p.m. And I remember very clearly, most of that time I was there, I was either distracted, falling asleep, or actually asleep. The process of studying could be described as tedious, drowsy, monotonous, boring. If I was studying a subject that I just happened to really enjoy, for me, that subject was like classics. I really like classical studies. I would be engaged, I'd be interested, I'd feel curious, and my learning would feel more effective. And at the time, I would just chalk it up to being like, this is a subject I happen to be better at. That is wrong. That is a subject where, for whatever reason, I was using a more involved, active learning strategy, and my brain was spending more effort. But because that effort was productive, my brain enjoyed it. Whereas, ironically, when I was passive and my brain was asleep and I was just trying to ram information down through repetition into my brain, it was not engaged, it was not interested, it was not actively being used. I wasn't thinking critically or deeply about what I was learning, and I was actually getting more tired and drowsy and sleepy because of it, because I was getting bored out. So if you want to get better at learning, don't try to make learning easy. Make learning harder. Look for ways to think more. Look at where you're learning and when you're studying, and pay attention to when you feel like your brain is actively involved in thinking, dissecting, putting the information together. It should feel, if you're studying effectively, like the information are pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that you're looking at together to see how it fits into a big picture. That is a very, very accurate representation of what effective learning should feel like for almost any subject for the rest of your life. I can promise that. And if it doesn't feel like that, see how you can make it feel like that. It will take more effort, but that's a good thing. Lesson number 7, make the hard stuff easy. So when I was in the middle of my third year of university, when I was starting to realize a lot of these things and I had started figuring out a lot more about how to study effectively, one of the things I realized was that my hard learning, the active, high quality stuff, was also so energy consuming and it was so exhausting to do that I started feeling daunted by sitting down to study, because I just knew how hard I would have to think about it. And if I am studying and I don't feel like I'm really putting all of that effort in, I feel disappointed in myself, like it's not effective and I just wasted my time. And so what I realized is that there are actually ways of still doing that difficult, effortful, high quality learning, but making it feel a lot less overwhelming and easy to just get into. And the trick here is something called layering and scaffolding. Layering and scaffolding our learning means that we approach the information in these rungs of difficulty. And this is what makes hard learning easy. So let's say that I have this book that I'm reading here, which is Contemporary Theories of Learning, which is, by the way, a great book, but can be pretty dense to read. Now, if I'm learning from this book, and I'm trying to learn as much as I can from every single chapter and get the full level of detail and retain 90% of that to the point where I've mastered everything in this book. That is a big task. And that is very challenging to be able to pull off like in a single study session. So layering and scaffolding that approach means that I set my goalpost a little bit easier. So instead of trying to get to that level for everything, I get to that level, so still doing that high quality thinking, still doing all of that deep evaluation, but I do that just for the parts of the information that I feel are easier for me to start with and understand and put together. I pick out the key ideas that I feel are already a little bit more intuitive, already a little bit more familiar, that I feel like are important building blocks for just understanding the overall scope of this topic. And so by the end of my 2-hour study session, I can't recite every single sentence in here. If you ask me what was the exact finding of a specific study or who said what about a particular theory, I can't tell you that. But I would be able to say, hey, there are 4 major types of theories that share what seem to be these types of similarities, but different these kinds of ways, and they seem to relate to each other like this. I can give you an overarching, big picture, but superficial overview of the topic. And so I'm developing really high quality foundational knowledge, but it's easier for me to do because I'm working with easier ideas that are more familiar to me. And by building that foundation, I now have a great stepping stone for my next layer or the next rung on the scaffold. So I can go through this information again, and this time I can look at it at a higher level of detail because I have more knowledge about the topic. So I now go through and still pick the things that feel more familiar and easy to me. And what you will find is that that paragraph that you read the first time and you thought, man, I have no idea what it's talking about, you read it now and you have new thoughts about it. You think, oh, I actually see what it means because you have more things to connect it to. And this is what I call the snowball effect of learning, is that as you learn more and get deeper and deeper, especially for big complex topics, it should get easier and easier because you have more things to connect it to and more ways to make it intuitive and relevant. Lesson number 8, build a learning system. There is no single technique that you can learn that is a be-all, end-all, where as soon as you learn that technique, you're done. That doesn't exist. And what that means is that you can't think of learning as a single technique or even 2 or 3 techniques. You have to think about learning as an entire system composed of multiple techniques that work together to support each other. And what I want to do for you is give you the basic components of what a learning system should be so that you can actually start building it. The easiest way to think about a learning system is to track the path of a single piece of information. It's almost like if you were to eat an apple, like a bite of an apple, you're just tracking the path of that bite through your body. When is the first time that information comes in? What do you do during that time? And then what happens afterwards? So for a lot of people, let's say you're a university student. For a lot of people, the first time the information comes in is during a lecture. And then what they do during that time is they write notes, maybe annotate some stuff, maybe record something, daydream, fall asleep, whatever it is. And then the next part where they look at that same piece of information might be in a review session. If you're proactive, later that day, same day, or it could be the day after, or maybe a week later, or if you're not really so on top of your studying, you don't review it until just before your exam. That's what most people's studying system looks like. It's really not much of a system. And so if this is your system, then there are a lot of problems with this, and it's no wonder that you may have difficulties. For example, if the first time you hear it is during a lecture where you have no control of the information pace and your ability to process that information is not super high, which some people naturally are super high and they're just very lucky. But for most of us, that processing level is not going to be super high without a lot of training. So you're already sort of starting off of a back foot. Like someone's just throwing information at you and you're desperately trying to catch it, but you're dropping half of it. And then so later when you review it, it's like almost as if you just may as well have just started studying it from scratch because it's all fragmented and you've just got bits of knowledge here and there and you're just going to go through the same material again, which is why a lot of people say, well, I need to go and rewatch that lecture. It's like, if you needed to rewatch the lecture anyway, why did you even go? just don't go and just, watch the lecture at your own pace. So to prevent this, the easiest way, like I mentioned before, is to not have that information hit you for the first time during a lecture. So every effective learning system should have a priming step. And priming means that you are preparing your brain to catch. Instead of just throwing something at someone and then just expecting them to catch it, you are saying, hey, I'm going to throw you this thing. Are you ready? Here's what it looks like. Here's how I'm going to throw it. Get ready to catch. And they're going to position themselves to catch, and it's going to be much easier to catch. That's what you're doing for your brain. You're priming your brain by giving it little anchor points, basic structures, a basic web of how to think about things, main ideas, tackling some of those difficult things that if you were to encounter it in the lecture, that's going to be your brain like for the next minute and a half missing everything that they say. Do that up front. And this can be done very effectively. Like I said, it can just be 20, 30 minutes for a 1 hour lecture to develop a really, really good priming or pre-study. And then following a priming event, you should have your what I call a main learning event. A main learning event means the first time you sit down with the intention to properly learn it. And this tends to be a time-intensive activity. So this could be, again, if you're a university student, your lecture. Attending the lecture could be the main learning event. It's the first time where you are dedicatedly, intensively sitting down to receive a high volume of information. If you're not attending lectures, it could be a dedicated, intensive study session for that topic. The priming session is not the main learning event because your intention is not to cover everything, and it's usually much shorter. So whether your main learning event is a lecture or a workshop or a seminar or a full day course or a long study session, after the prime is the main learning event. And during this main learning event, we want to make sure that we are thinking actively, we're thinking deeply about it, and we're trying to avoid creating learning debt. So we're really aiming for that effective learning, not just creating debt for ourselves. And after a main learning event, we should always have a review. Now, when you do the review or how often you do the review depends on how much material you're learning, how complicated that material is, and how good the processing you do in the main learning event is. If you are very, very good at processing and after learning something just one time, you have a very high retention of it, then you don't need to do a review for that for potentially a week or so. But if your learning strategies are not quite there yet, and you know that if you wait a week, you're already going to have forgotten 50, 60% of it, then you should do a review earlier. And so as a rule of thumb, if you are just a general normal student, is to try to review it 1 day, 1 week, then 1 month after. And that timing is flexible, like it doesn't have to be exact. Just try to do it within the first kind of 1 or 2 days, and then roughly next week-ish, and then roughly sort of 2 to 4 to 5 weeks after that. It's up to you to figure out your timing and how often you need to do your revisions. But what's more important is actually what you do during those revision sessions. So whenever you do the revision, you should be actively looking for gaps and holes in your understanding. You're not just trying to cover the stuff that you already know and are confident in. You're actively looking for the parts that you've missed or you've forgotten. You should also be testing yourself rather than just using something like recognition, where you just look at your notes and think, yep, that makes sense to me. You should be testing it based on your memory and testing it in a way that's similar to how you know you're going to need it eventually. So that usually means not just regurgitating facts, but also more complex, deeper types of thinking. And as another tip, try to address your biggest problems first. So what this means is that if you've fundamentally completely misunderstood a concept, that's more important for you to spend your time to fix up than a little fact or a detail that you forgot to recall. Major issues with how concepts relate to each other are much more likely to impact your ability to perform for a much wider range of different tests or applications than just that single isolated fact. And the longer you leave it, the harder it gets to go and then like restudy all of that stuff if you realize a major error later on. Now, as an optional part, if you have a lot of stuff that you do think you need to just memorize that doesn't really connect with anything, there isn't a deeper way to think about it, and it's just a matter of like memorizing it through repetition, then you should also be using some kind of memorization tool or technique. And for most situations, flashcards is a great place to start. And that kind of runs in parallel to all of this stuff. It's just you do the flashcards that are due whenever they are due, just making sure that you're not creating so much learning debt that all of your time is spent just doing flashcards. Again, I can go into this learning system in a lot more detail later on, but this is what I would consider to be the major basic components of a learning system. And if you're missing even one of these components, there are probably going to be very clear issues with your performance or your consistency or your confidence that you could just literally point to what the problem is and the part that's missing in your learning system and connect the dots. And I also, if you're interested, I've got a free quiz that you can do, which will map out your learning system for you on some of the most important principles. And it will output a score for the different sections of a learning system so that you can have a better idea of where to work on first. If you're interested in that, it's free for you to do. There's a link in the description below. Number 9, start simple and build slow. If you just listen to me talk about this learning system stuff and you feel like, man, I haven't got like any part of this learning system, there are so many things that I'm going to have to work on, then that's fine. Don't worry. Like, you, along with everyone else, are in the same boat. I was in exactly the same position. In fact, I was in the same position, but worse, because no one told me what I had to work towards. But the most important piece of advice I can give you for when you're improving your learning system is to build things slowly and swap out what you're already doing with simple strategies that work. A really common mistake that I see my students make, because when I teach people how to have a learning system, I teach them like everything that they need to know. Like the stuff that took me years to figure out, they're learning it in like 3.5 lessons. So they're exposed to so many different techniques that, understandably, they start trying to use all of these techniques all at the same time. And so their learning system kind of goes from 0 to 100 in a single step. And that's completely not sustainable. There's no chance that you're going to be successful at learning if you try to change too many things too quickly. And this is because a lot of the ways that you learn are habits. And so you're really trying to unlearn and relearn new habits all at the same time. And your brain is actually not biologically capable of making that much change so quickly. So the much better approach that is going to help you to get better performance locked in as quickly as possible is to just look at what you're already doing, which may be like terrible. Okay, that's fine. Wherever you're starting from, just pick a strategy that you think could help you in a way and just swap out one part of what you're doing with that part. And just slowly upgrade your system as each new thing becomes a habit. And by doing that, for every change you make, you're going to get an improvement. Problems you have right now are going to be solved. If you have 10 things that you're trying to work on because you've got 10 different problems, then you're going to have those 10 same problems until you fix all 10 of them. It's much better to just take 10 problems, start with 1, and then have 9 problems to deal with, and then 8, and then 7. Your life just progressively gets easier and easier. But I can promise you that if you have all of these things to work on and you try to fix all of them at the same time, you will spend a lot of time trying to work on lots of things, and then after 3 months, realize that you still have the same problems, and then you'll be back to square one, deciding to just start with one thing all over again. You will just waste that time. I promise you that this will happen. So please, just start simple and build slow. Lesson number 10, create a learning log. If I think back to when I was first in uni, and I think about now, I cannot even count the number of experiments and trials that I've run with the way that I study. It's literally will be in the thousands. And it's unavoidable for any learner trying to become more efficient. If what you're doing is trying to improve the process and not just win through effort alone, which we already said is usually not possible, you are going to have to do a lot of trial and error and experimentation. And even if you are starting simple and building slow, there are lots of things that will be on your mind for you to try to improve on, and lots of ideas, and that's a good thing. The problem is that it can be very overwhelming. And I spent the first solid few years working on multiple different things here and there and not really making the type of progress that I should have made for the amount of time I was spending, because I was just dabbling in so many different types of techniques and avenues of improvement. And instead, what I should have been doing is just picking one path, improving that, fixing this problem, doing enough trial and error until that problem is gone, and then moving on to the next one. And then again, doing that experimentation, stacking those gains until that problem is gone. And to make it much easier to figure out which direction you're heading in and how to stack those experiments and fix that problem, and to move more effectively, a learning log is extremely helpful. A learning log is basically a record of the experiments you're doing, what you're trying to do with that experiment, why you're doing it, and then how that experiment went. It's like a record of your progress. And I previously talked about a learning log in another video, and a lot of you guys wanted me to show you how to actually create a learning log. So I'll give you a basic template that you could follow right now. You can do this on anything. At the time, I just used a Google Sheet, but you could use Notion, you could use Roam or Obsidian or whatever it is that you want. It really doesn't matter. There are really 6 core parts of what creates an effective learning log. The first part is what your experiment or experience is. This is usually just like 1 or 2 sentences about what you're trying to do, what change you're trying to make. The second part is defining what progress looks like for you. This makes it much easier to realize if you are going in the right direction or not. So for example, if you're trying a new technique for the very, very first time, then progress for you is not going to be, yeah, I figured it out and I fixed it like in one single go. Otherwise, you will need a learning log, right? You just find a problem, you fix it, and you're done. But it takes trial and error to fix it. So your initial stages of progress with a new technique is not going to be, I solved the problem. It's going to be, I realized a barrier or an obstacle or a challenge that I didn't expect with this solution and this experiment. I realized more about the problem than I knew before. And you're equipping yourself with more information to later be able to solve it. And it's only in the later experiments that you're actually likely to properly fix it. So you want to spend the second time writing a few sentences about what you think would be a win for you. So the experiment is, I'm going to try mind mapping. Then the progress condition is, I tried mind mapping and I found a couple of challenges with doing this effectively that I didn't realize before. And by taking the time to write it up front, it's much more motivating and it keeps a more accurate count of the progress we're making with our skill development, as opposed to thinking we're not making any progress because we haven't fixed the issue, when actually we're making really good progress. We just didn't realize it. The third part is a reflection of how it actually went. So this is you now doing the thing that you tried to do, and you're reflecting on how you found it. Here, the key is to just be very specific about what actually happened and not make broad overarching statements or try to rationalize why things happened, because that's the next part. Number 4 is trends and habits. Trends and habits is about looking at what happened in your reflection, which is basically just like a data dump of what happened when you tried the experiment. And now you're looking at it very critically to see, are there any patterns or similarities or trends with previous experiences or experiments or habits about myself, about the way I tend to think or respond to certain things that I can see occur again and again. This is really where most of your improvement is going to come from. It's your ability to realize certain habits and patterns of thinking that consistently hold you back. A really common one, for example, let's say you tried mind mapping and then you did it and then you found all these difficulties with it. The trend could be that every time I do a type of learning that makes me think more deeply, I tend to think that it's not working, and so I go back to doing what I'm used to. I'm not used to making learning hard. Like that could be a really, really key insight. And you can see how realizing that is just like completely life transforming in terms of your ability to improve. Number 5 is thinking about the actions that you can take based on those insights. So you'll find a bunch of different trends, a bunch of things that you think you could improve on for next time and optimizations that you can make. And then you turn those into action items for you to work on. So that in number 6, you prioritize. Like I said, start simple, build slow. If you've got 10 different things that you realize that you can improve on, you can't work on all 10 of those things. So pick just 1 or 2 for you to focus on, and that becomes your next experiment that you add to your log. And anytime you're feeling Little demotivated? Just scroll back like 2 months ago in your log and think about the problems and the way that you thought about it then versus how you think about it now, and you'll realize this process just transforms you. It is this process repeated hundreds and thousands of times that allowed me to go from a desperate student working 20 hours a day to just barely hang in there to someone who studied so little. People asked me, how do I do all the other things that I do? Lesson 11, measure your true learning efficiency. There's a student that I've just recently finished coaching who's a surgical trainee. So they're a registered doctor. They've been practicing for 9 or 10 years now, and they're just about finished with their general surgical training program. They're one step away from being like a senior doctor, and they've already failed this exam one time, and they're really motivated to crack it on their second go. And so we got to a point in this coaching where we had figured out a really good system for him to use that worked alongside his high workload and helped him find those tiny little gaps and address them effectively. And we'd run it for a couple of weeks, and he was finding that it was working really well. And then a week passes, and he sends me this email before the next consultation where he says, hey, Justin, I feel like something is really going wrong here. I feel really slow. I feel like my learning is actually slipping backwards. I feel like I'm getting worse than before when I started. So I was like, cool, we should, well, not cool, but let's address this. So we caught up, and in the consultation, I asked him what was going on. And this is basically the story that he painted. He said that before, he would have a single piece of a topic that he would need to cover, and covering that topic would take him around 3 hours. And now it was taking him like 5 hours to cover that same topic, and he's still not able to perform in certain ways like he used to be able to. Before, when his seniors would ask him certain questions, he would be able to recall a lot more of those facts and those details than he is able to now. And now when his seniors are asking the questions, sometimes he doesn't actually know because he hasn't gotten to a point where he feels solid on that knowledge yet. So when you look at this, someone going from 3 hours to 5 hours, that seems like a clear situation where their efficiency has gone down, right? Not quite. So I said, okay, let's think about what's happening right now. Are you able to get to a point where you can use your knowledge, think about it together, and apply them in more complicated ways, where you can have a curveball, an unusual case, and you know how to think about it and how to navigate that topic? Like you feel you have a good intuitive understanding of that topic. And he said, yes, I feel like I'm able to achieve that now. So we call that a high level. So are you able to achieve a high level right now? Yes. How long does it take you? Okay, it takes about that 5 hours to cover the topic. Plus, I'm now spending maybe an extra hour of reviewing that information later. So in total, it's taking me about 6 hours. Okay, and what about the low level? So you're saying that you're not able to reach that low level. He said, yeah, right now I'm able to reach about 50% of that low level in the same 6 hours that I'm spending. So I said, okay, well now let's compare that to what you were doing before. So you said before it was taking you 3 hours to cover this topic. So before, were you able to get to this high level where you have that intuitive understanding and you're able to think about the topic in multiple different ways and use them in these complex applications? And he said, no, that's something that I've always struggled with. He said that he remembers being early on a junior in a training program and really struggling with that. So I said, okay, well, how many hours would you spend on trying to reach this level? Not including just going over it the first time, but in terms of time spent going over it again and again and testing yourself again and all these other repetitions combined. And he said, well, easily like over 20 hours. And after 20 hours, were you able to get there? He said, no, he still was not able to get there most of the time. So I said, okay, well, what about this low level? What were you able to get to? So he said, yeah, low level was really good. He was able to get to 90% plus of that low level. And was it in the 3 hours that he said? No, the 3 hours was just the amount of time taken to cover the information the first time. And when I asked him how long it took to cover that information again and again, how many times he had to repeat it to learn it, it was double that amount of time. So it was 6 hours. So now this is a very different picture. He has gone from spending 6 total hours, including all the relearning of stuff that he had forgotten, to get to 90% here, and spending 20 plus hours, really infinity, because he never was able to reach this. And now he's gone to a point where in 6 hours, he is reaching this, a level he's never been able to reach, regardless of how much time he spent on this. And yes, his low-level fact recall is suffering at the moment, but we've got plenty of hours to spare that we can just plug in to the low-level, simple solutions, add a few flashcards, do some memorization to pad that up. And this is how you look at learning efficiency. Learning efficiency is not how long does it take to cover a topic. Covering a topic means nothing. Learning efficiency is how long does it take in total to reach the level you need to reach. And most people that struggle with their studying spend an infinite amount of time because they never reach the level, no matter how much time they spend. And when you look at these two situations, which person would you rather be? This one or this one? Lesson number 12. Make confidence answer sheets. This is what I think may be one of the easiest and most underrated ways of using practice questions and past papers. When I was going through medical school, I used to do so many practice questions. There was this website that I'd sign up to, and it had I think an endless number of questions that I could do that tested me in a way that was similar to how the university would test me. And everyone in my class used this service, and it was great. The problem is that I was doing so many questions, like thousands of questions, in order for me to gain a 4, 5, 6% increase in my performance. And there are so many times where there is something that I covered in those practice questions, and then a very similar question comes up in an exam, and I just can't remember, and I still get it wrong. And the same thing happens at all levels, like that surgical trainee that I was talking to you about just before. The reason that they failed their final examination was because the way that they had been preparing had these gaps that they had never realized. Like they hadn't gotten enough feedback from their seniors to realize that there was this part of thinking about the topic that they hadn't thought of before. And making a confidence answer sheet solves that. A confidence answer sheet means you take a set of practice questions, which you can get from anywhere. And when you do them, do not look at an answer sheet first. Instead, go through each question and rate your confidence of your answer. This becomes the most important piece of information for you to improve. After you've made your confidence sheet, go through everything that you had a low level of confidence for and study it to the point where you feel confident. Confident either in the fact that, yep, you actually got that wrong and now you definitely know the right answer, or confident that, yep, you got the right answer, but now you know for sure. So get to a point where every single answer you wrote, you have confidence on. If you have low confidence for an answer, it means that there is a gap in your knowledge there. And even if you happen to have gotten the right answer, it means that you could get a very similar question in the exam and then get it wrong. You may have just gotten lucky. So confidence is actually the most important indicator of your knowledge. Once you do your studying to get to a high level of confidence for all of your answers, you can then compare that to the real answer sheet. And that can reveal another layer of mistakes, because you can have something that you initially had very high confidence on, and so you didn't bother studying that more. But then when you check the actual answers, it turns out to be wrong. That is almost always a major red flag. Like that is a high priority area for you to study again, because there is probably a significant issue with how you've understood it, or a significant gap in your knowledge. High confidence with a wrong answer means that you don't even have the awareness of the problem. That is a high priority for you to spend your time to study more into. Alternatively, there may be something that was a low confidence that you studied to get to a high confidence, but then you check the answer and it's still wrong. Again, that means that that's something that you should go in and study a little bit more, because it means that the way that you thought about that topic was flawed in some way. There was probably some kind of angle you were missing, or some relationship or connection between the ideas that you didn't quite see, which meant that even after studying it, you weren't able to connect the dots. The reason this type of error is important is because it tells you about the way you tend to think about information. If you made that mistake here, then you've probably made that mistake somewhere else as well. If you use this confidence answer sheet system, I can guarantee you the amount of questions and practice you need to do to develop real confidence and plug those gaps in your knowledge will drop by at least half. Yes, it does take a little bit longer to go through a set of questions, but in terms of quality learning that happens per hour of you doing this activity, it is like one of the most high yield, valuable strategies that I have within my toolkit. Lesson number 13, learn to swim before you're drowning. When I was in my second year of uni, one of my classmates posted up something a week before the exam. They were saying, hey, I've been studying this stuff and I feel like really overwhelmed. I feel like I'm really behind on this. What is the best thing I can do before this exam in just a few days from now? And so I replied, lower your standards. And that was, it was obviously a joke. It was my claim to fame. It was liked by like 70 people in my class. It was like the most popular I had ever been. But it's kind of true, is that if you're feeling like I've only got a week left before my exam and I've got all the stuff I need to work on, what can I do? It's kind of like trying to learn to swim while you're already drowning. It's, there's maybe a few things that could potentially help here and there, but really it's the position you're in the first place. And so if you're thinking about working on these skills and improving your learning efficiency, that's great. That's fantastic. I want everyone that watches my videos to feel that way. Don't wait until you feel like it's imminent, like you need it. Because by the time you feel like you need it, it's probably because there's an exam coming up. You're already falling behind, something like that. If you're already in that position, it makes it so much harder for you to actually improve. Some of my students actually take a gap year just to work on their learning skills so that when they enter into the year, they can just do it full force. And that's, if you can, that's actually a really good strategy. And I know that's not possible for everyone, but if you're in the summer holidays and you've got a break, study, cram ahead, take your whole year's curriculum that's about to come up, use that as practice material to hone your learning skills. Give yourself a time limit of how much to study, give yourself tests to do, and actually use that time. Or you can go to the beach and enjoy your life. But if you want to, spend that time to develop your skills if it's really important to you. And it means that you will have much better skills so that the year goes by more smoothly. And as an added bonus, because you use the actual material for that year, you've also got a head start. You did some early cramming. And if you don't have access to that, then you can even just make your own curriculum. You could get ChatGPT to just literally generate a curriculum for you, or you can use Wikipedia. It doesn't have to be exactly the same as what you're about to cover. Even if it's 50% similar, that's a 50% head start. And the primary benefit is that you're honing your skills without that external added pressure. You're giving yourself that hyperbolic time chamber, the training time of being able to just focus on working on your skills and then go swimming. If right now you feel like it's something that's worth pursuing, next year it's going to be even more important. It's not going to solve itself. This is a lifelong skill. So the earlier you develop it, the more benefit you get for the rest of your life. And if you want the best place to start on learning to swim and you'd rather save yourself some of that trial and error, then remember that free quiz that I mentioned that helps you map out your learning system. That link is in the description. Or if you want to just jump straight into it, I've also got a training program that you can check out. Again, the link to that is in the description at iCanStudy.com. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.